The atheist will have you believe that it is the religious person, in this context specifically speaking from the perspective of Christianity, because I think this will best illustrate the examples given. They will have you believe that the Christian or the religious person in general, that they are crazy, that they have their entire worldview based in myths and legends, no evidence, that it's completely nonsensical. They'll even use terms like, I don't believe in your sky daddy, which is kind of weird. But that is the view of the atheist, that the religious person is the one that lacks any logic or evidence, and that they are totally sound in their rejection of the idea of a God. Now, here's the struggle. Anytime you try to use some kind of logical reasoning or rationality to come to a conclusion about the truth of the origins of the universe, whether or not there's a God, any way that you go about it, you're going to encounter some kind of logical contradictions. So if you believe that there always was a universe, or there always was something infinitely, you have the problem of infinite regress and so on. If you believe that that a being outside of space and time, an infinite creative being made everything, you also run into logical issues. And the scientific evidence shows, and this is where religious people will agree with the consensus of scientific thought today, is that the universe did have a beginning at some point, except the scientist will say that something happened before that caused it, again, leading to some kind of contradictions and logical issues. The religious person will say that it is a divine creator that always existed, again, leading to some kind of contradictions in logic. So how do we go about discerning what is more likely to be the truth of the matter? And this is where we can get into internal evidences in our world that we can observe to point us at least in the direction of which is more likely to be true from the methodologies we usually use to discern what might be true. So we're not going to have proofs, but we can provide some kind of evidence. Now, this is where the religious person, specifically the Christian for this example that I'm using, I'm not a Christian, but I think it will best illustrate this. This is where the religious person actually is the one with more evidence to put forth. The atheist argues from a position of silence, meaning they will make the false axiomatic claim that the fact that there is a lack of evidence means there is an evidence of a lack of some kind, and this is where the religious ideas actually win out. So let's go down that kind of logical reasoning for a moment at how we arrive at some kind of understanding that will point us in the direction of what is actually more likely, even if we can't come at some kind of definitive logical proof. So we're not going to come at proof through logic. We can use philosophy to guide us along the way into getting to some kind of truth, but it's not going to get us all the way there. We can't prove the existence of God, nor can we disprove the existence of God. So we must look at the evidence that points us in the direction of the truth. So what are we talking about when we say evidences that would show that the religious person, again, in this case, the Christian, would actually have more grounds to stand on with their claims of some kind of evidence? So there are 2 points in history, in recorded history, the atheist will refer to as mythological things, but they are recorded history, 2 massive incidents or collection of incidents that provide proof or evidence to the idea of divine revelation. And that's how we can know something about God and the existence of the universe and the origins of the universe. It's through the revelation of the divine. Now, what are those 2 occurrences in history that we're talking about? The first one would be the revelation of God to the Israelites at Sinai. Wait, I know what you're going to say. It's myths and legends from the Bible. Well, here's the thing, though. Saying that would dismiss everything we know about all of history before there was video cameras, and even then, it could invalidate a lot of historical claims. What we're talking about here is an occurrence of a revelation of the divine to humanity, witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people, passed on to all of their children through the generations in a continuous, unbroken tradition till today that says that that actually happened. Not only that, it is further corroborated by other faiths and people accepting that as truth, not that consensus determines truth, but it is at least some kind of evidence that that is the truth, that more than half of the world today actually accepts that claim of an unbroken tradition that goes back to Sinai that the Jewish people have. Now, the second, and dismissing that would dismiss a lot of what we know about history. So that's a little bit problematic to get into for the atheist, especially when you're talking about speculations about evolution and so on. Now, the other occurrence that happens is the life and miracles, and then if you're a Christian, the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. If you're a Muslim, it would be the supposed death and ascension of Jesus. This life of Jesus is another major example of mass divine revelation, meaning, according to the recorded history that secular scholars now accept to be true from a historical standpoint, Jesus of Nazareth came, performed all these miracles, and then according to the true claims of belief in him by his followers, was crucified and then resurrected from the dead. Now, this actually is part of also lending more credibility to the original revelation at Sinai. Jews don't like to admit that while they say that Christianity depends on Judaism from a text standpoint, it's actually Judaism that relies on Christianity for a lot of corroboration, but that's a topic for another video. So there is this claim to these miracles performed by Jesus and then a recorded history of his death and resurrection. Now, you might think that that's not true, and that's fine. Again, I'm not a Christian. However, the historical evidence actually points to it being true, meaning secular scholars have come to the consensus that the disciples of Jesus, who claim to have seen him alive to the tune of, in some cases, 500 people in one occurrence, that they had a genuine belief that he was actually resurrected. They saw him after he was crucified, alive and well, with certain indicators that he was actually crucified. Now, the atheist will come and try to subvert that and say, well, it could be that there was a volcano at Sinai and ash clouds and all this stuff. It wasn't really a revelation from God. And Jesus deceived people. He didn't really die, or it was an imposter pretending to be Jesus after the fact. Well, there's a lot of problem with that explanation. Number one, there's no evidence from a geographical standpoint that shows us that there are any volcanoes there that could have erupted at Sinai. You'd also be invalidating a lot of history and historic claims, and claims about the reality of the geography of the region. It actually makes less sense to say that Moses timed a volcanic eruption to magnify his giving of these laws to the Jewish people and pretending it's God, and also that they weren't killed by the erupting volcano. That actually is a more fantastical claim in some ways than the idea that it was a God that revealed himself to them. So that's one issue. And then on the other side, the idea that the apostles who lived with Jesus and knew him well were somehow deceived by an imposter fake Jesus, that's also a bit of a false claim that you can't really point to as evidence. We do have evidence now pointing to both of these things being true. Now, whether you accept that evidence, is it enough evidence? That would obviously be based on some kind of faith claim. However, it is the atheist that lacks justification for their standpoint. It is the religious person that has more evidence pointing to an internal idea that shows that God would be real. Because when you, again, go to the logical ideas of what would have happened, you reach a dead end of logical contradictions any way that you look at it. Now, the atheist will then come with the further set. Well, if God is contradictory in logic, how can you believe in God? Well, if you've already come to the conclusion that there is a God, you would understand that your human intellect is incapable of abstracting that idea about what could be logical for God, whereas the atheist doesn't have that objective claim of God to rest on to justify why there would be logical contradictions in their worldview. I also want to point out that this does not apply to all religious traditions. If you're looking at Eastern traditions, for example, this evidence is not there. And number two, there are even further logical issues with it. For example, Alan Watts, who popularized a lot of Eastern thinking in the West, would start a lot of conversations about it with, well, if you were the divine, well, he's saying why you wouldn't believe in a biblical narrative, you would believe in an Eastern narrative to it. Well, if you were God, you would do it like this. You would want this. You would come as this. You would play this game with yourself, the lila, the world, the maya, the world illusion, the game that God is playing with himself. Again, this falls back on the logical issue of determining what you with your human intellect would do if you were the eternal, uncreated creator of everything. So there's a real problem with Eastern religions that actually falls more into the problems that the atheist would face rather than the problems that a Abrahamic religion would encounter. Now, here the atheist will come and say, well, whether or not these historical claims are recorded or, they genuinely believed in these things, it cannot be true because gods don't reveal themselves on mountaintops. There is no God, and people don't rise from the dead. So that would also be a false claim because that doesn't happen. Now, the problem here is that the atheist is actually the one using the circular reasoning that they accuse the religious person of. They are presupposing that people don't rise from the dead, who would be if it was God and as a man, but that's a whole nother story. They're presupposing things about what could happen and then saying the evidence isn't real that it happened because we've already presupposed that it can't happen. Gods don't reveal themselves on mountaintops, therefore, even though you have evidence that shows God did, we're going to deny it. People don't rise from the dead, so therefore, even though you show us that somebody rose from the dead, we won't believe it. And the problem with that is, those same atheists will say, well, show us proof. Well, here's the problem. You could literally have somebody shot in the head, die, be pronounced dead, then rise from the dead with the bullet hole still in their head, and that same atheist will deny that it's a resurrection, even if they witnessed it themselves, because they've already presupposed that it cannot be true. So what we find here is that when you boil things down, every faith system, whether you're a Christian or an atheist, because they are also making faith claims, though they will deny it, those are faith-based claims, you're always going to encounter a logical contradiction of some kind. The difference is that with the religious person, the final resting place for that logical contradiction is on the divine creator, who may have the ability, because he's the creator, to not have a problem with those logical contradictions. However, the atheist finally comes to the point where their logical contradiction has no safety net to fall into. And so that's why when you actually boil it down to the fact of reasoning and internal evidence, you actually have the religious person who has the stronger, more authentic claim to truth than the atheist.